We're missing one committee member, but I think we're okay. We got the big boss here and he gave us the go ahead here. So, as you know, we have a two-part thesis defense in this department. We have a public seminar, and I think Paul said that he's going to try to go for about 45 minutes. And at that point, we'll open it up for questioning. And then we'll go into closed session. And we'll give Paul a really hard time in the closed session. And hopefully he can survive that part. I think all of you know Paul, but real briefly, Paul graduated as a chemistry degree from DePaul University. And he went to industry for a while. What was the name of the company? Stepan. And he worked as a polymer engineer, polymer scientist for a while. And just going back to DePaul, actually, his research there was actually related to neurodegenerative disease. So I think when he came to Wisconsin, he actually joined the wrong group. I think he was I think he went to industry for a while, saw the light, and he joined us in 2014. 14, yeah. So Paul has been doing research, it's collaborative research. Thomas E. Johansson is sitting here in front, and Dr. Nate Sambo and Dr. Downer Peters. This project, this peptide that you hear about, was actually developed here on campus in the biochemistry department with Dean Mosher. He actually derived this peptide. Paul's been very busy while he was here, very active. And I just wanted to commend him for that. He was the usual coursework that you guys have to take, the research, very active. He worked in the station. I had an opportunity to work with Mark Zucchetti in the station and learned a lot. I think a lot of my students have learned a lot. And numerous awards. I think that's one of the interesting things. You never know when students will end up getting awards, but he's gotten numerous awards, particularly from the American Association of Pharmaceutical Scientists for his research. And I give him a lot of credit for that. Paul actually has already started another job. He left us in January, right? And he works for Mallinckrodt in St. Louis. And he promised me that he'd come back and defend. Because this is the first time something like this has happened. So, yeah, with that, why don't we get started?
All right. Well, thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you to all of you for coming to my presentation here today. It does feel it feels phenomenal to finally be here. It's been quite a few years. Today I will describe and present the culmination of my thesis work. This work was centered on a very special peptide that, in my opinion, has numerous applications besides the context that we evaluated it in. This peptide is called the functional upstream domain peptide. We developed a PEGylated variant of it and applied it in a renal fibrosis context. So this presentation will be split into three main sections. In the first chapter, I will discuss the synthesis as well as the characterization of the PEGylated FUD or PEG-FUD. In the second chapter, I will talk about its evaluation in a murine renal fibrosis model. And then lastly, in the third chapter, I will talk about one additional feature of PEGylation, which is potentially delayed subcutaneous absorption of the drug following the administration of the drug. So without further ado, let's first focus on the actual disease. So our disease is renal fibrosis. Renal fibrosis is the ultimate endpoint of this larger umbrella of a pathology called chronic kidney disease. It is of high impact because 20 million Americans currently suffer from it. Now, the last final therapeutic approach to treating renal fibrosis is kidney transplantation, but the problem with that approach, besides the availability of kidneys, is the fact that there comes a 5 to 10 year graft failure rate of approximately 30 and 50% respectively, meaning that it's not a viable solution to the problem. The key hallmark feature of renal fibrosis that I'd like to highlight today is that it is linked to a excessive deposition of connective tissue in the diseased kidney. The current standard of care for renal fibrosis involves ACE inhibitors as well as type 1 angiotensin II receptor blockers. The logic behind this strategy is that by regulating blood pressure and fluid balance, we can reduce glomerular hyperfiltration as well as albuminuria, and overall reduce the decline in kidney function with this therapy. However, the problem is that while it's effective at slowing down the renal function decline, it does not stop or reverse the morphological damage that is done to the kidneys. Thus, this is not the ultimate therapy that we'd be interested in. On top of that, cellular pathway altering small molecules are associated with detrimental pleiotropic effects, which in this case includes hyperkalemia, which is an increase of plasma concentration of potassium. So for this reason, alternative approaches are needed for the treatment of renal fibrosis. Now, one such approach involves the inhibition of deposition of fibronectin. Now, the reason why we think there is value in this approach is that fibronectin deposition is associated with quite a few things that exacerbate the symptoms of fibrosis. One of those things is that fibronectin helps the ECM deposition and maturation of collagen fibers. Another thing is that fibronectin facilitates the activation of TGF-beta, which itself has a pro-fibrosis signal. And then lastly, fibronectin is also known to facilitate the attachment of inflammatory lymphocytes that themselves also secrete cytokines and just exacerbate the symptoms of fibrosis. So to zoom in on fibronectin itself now, fibronectin is a ubiquitous ECM protein. It's quite large. It's around 440 Daltons large. It's dimeric. And most importantly, the development of fibronectin ECM fibrils is a cell-mediated process. So in other words, it does not spontaneously happen. There need to be cells involved. Now the most important element of fibronectin fibril assembly is the 70K N-terminal region of fibronectin. Now it's important because fibroblasts in fact recognize fibronectin, the 70K, and it has been shown in research many times that once 70K is separated from fibronectin fibrillogenesis is arrested. So in other words, 70K is the functional element that is necessary for fibronectin fibrillogenesis. Knowing this, the lab of Dr. P. Mosher here at UW Madison has designed this peptide called the functional upstream domain peptide. It is unstructured, or in other words, it assumes a random chiral conformation when it's in solution. Most importantly, it has a tight, low nanomolar affinity for the 70K region of fibronectin. Skip this, but FUD actually originates from the F1 adhesive protein of Streptococcus pyogenes, so that's how we got it. So lastly, FUD has been shown both in vitro and in vivo to inhibit fibronectin fibril assembly. So the mode of action of FUD is this. It binds to the canonical fold of the 70K, and then binds to these 6 subdomains of the 70K on fibronectin, and through this binding, FUD is able to prevent recognition of FUD by integrins on cells, and thus prevent fibronectin fibril assembly. This approach has been tested in a few models in the past. I would like to present just briefly this liver fibrosis work that was done by a group out of Germany in 2015. In this, following IP injections of FUD into mice, it was found the amount of fibrotic tissue in the liver was normalized, and most importantly, the liver function was also improved. So overall, we also have a lineups of background information. I will not go into the meat of this presentation today. At the very start, we have to generate FUD itself. So to do that, we use a VL21 expression vector platform to express the FUD peptide. We purified our final synthesis products using nickel NTA agarose polymer kind of purification. We then took the final synthesis product, we purified it once more using ion exchange chromatography, and we verified its molecular weight using liquid chromatography tandem mass spec. Shown here is a chromatogram from an ion exchange purification. You see a singular peak eluting. This peak was collected and fractionated to generate our FUD peptide stock solution. The identity of our synthesis product was verified using LCMS, and we see that the observed mass of our synthesis product corresponded to the theoretical mass of FUD peptide with an excellent 0.6 parts per million mass accuracy. With the FUD peptide in hand, we then moved down to actually PEGylating it. And for this, we used an N-terminal reductive amination chemistry scheme in which the primary amine on the FUD peptide reacts with the aldehyde functionality on the PEG to form a Schiff base that is then reduced with sodium cyanoborohydride to form covalent linkage between the FUD peptide and the PEG molecule. We are able to maintain N-terminal specificity in this reaction scheme by exploiting the 2 pKa unit difference between the N-terminus of the FUD peptide and the primary amines present on the 5 lysine residues that the FUD peptide has. Thus, through using a pH that's low enough, we are able to react in one specific place. The final reaction conditions for this reaction were a pH of 5.5, a cold 4 degrees Celsius bath condition, 16-hour reaction time, 10 EQ excess of PEG relative to the FUD peptide, and sodium cyanoborohydride as a reducing agent. We isolated and purified PEG-FUD once again using ion exchange chromatography. And then we finally characterized our final reaction products using reverse phase HPLC, gel emission chromatography, MALDI mass spec, MALDI top mass spec, isothermal titration calorimetry, and a matrix assembly in vitro assay. We ultimately ended up generating 3 flavors of PEG-FUD with 3 different molecular weights. We calculated FUD using 10K, 20K, and 40K PEG. Now, the reason for why we wanted to have 3 different PEG-FUDs is rooted in the nature of glomerular filtration. It's quite known that glomerular filtration is proportional to the molecular weight, or inversely proportional, I'm sorry, to the molecular weight of the substrate. So in other words, bigger things are not filtered as well as smaller things. So having 3 PEG-FUDs allows us to ask the question of how will increasingly larger PEG-FUD behave in vivo. We'll be equipped to answer that question, and also more approximately, in our interest, it will allow us to ask the question of how will larger PEGylation affect the binding affinity of PEG-FUD for fibronectin. To illustrate my first point, I included a figure showing the plasma concentration over time of PEGs of different lengths, and we see that small PEG is cleared quite rapidly. And as you increase the rate of PEG from 6,000 to 20,000, often the PEG stays around a bit longer. And then as you keep increasing, the 170 kilodalton PEG remains in the blood for much longer time. So having synthesized PEG-FUD, we purified using ion exchange chromatography. Shown here is one chromatogram, or an overlay of 3 chromatograms of the differently sized PEG-FUDs. You see a large central peak eluting in the middle of this chromatogram. This peak was fractionated and pooled to generate the PEG-FUD stock solution that was used for further experiments. We then used several techniques to characterize what was synthesized. Here is a chromatograph from HPLC, reverse phase HPLC. This technique discriminates analytes based on their hydrophobic interactions with the column. And we see that the retention time of PEG-FUDs increased relative to FUD occurring to molecular weight as expected. Gel emission chromatography is another technique that we utilize. This is a size exclusion technique in which larger things can do it first, We see that the 40K PEG-FUD eluted first and FUD eluted last, in accordance with the molecular weight of our synthesis products. Now, lastly, we were interested in verifying the molecular weight of what we actually synthesized to check if, for example, if we doubly PEGylated FUD accidentally, or if something strange was happening. So to do that, we use small d-top mass spectrometry, and we see that the observed mass of the 20K PEG-FUD was roughly what we expected for it to be, thus verifying a singly PEGylated PEG-FUD. The same was true with our other PEG-FUD candidates. The observed mass and expected mass of the 10K and 40K PEG-FUD matched once again. So having synthesized PEG-FUD and having done some characterization of them, we then moved on to asking the question of how will PEGylation affect the interaction of FUD with fibronectin. To do this, we use isothermal titration calorimetry as our technique of choice. This is a technique that involves titration of a ligand to a chamber containing its binding partner, and this instrument is able to detect microcalorie amounts of heat that are evolved following this binding event. So we see lots of peaks here. Each one of these peaks corresponds to one titration event. Each of these peaks can be integrated to calculate to determine the total heat evolved, and then this value can be plotted versus the molar ratio of the ligand and the binding partner present in the reaction chamber at any particular moment, which should produce this characteristic sigmoidal curve that can be fit with a best fit curve. From that best fit curve, we can then extract some thermodynamic parameters. These parameters include the KD of the interaction, or in other words, the binding affinity, as well as the enthalpy change, the Gibbs free energy change, and the entropy change associated with the interaction. Or in other words, it will allow us to answer the question of how will PEGylation affect the binding affinity of FUD for fibronectin. We did these experiments with all 4 compounds. We did them in triplicates, and here is a summary of the binding parameters that we have obtained. So we see that the negative enthalpy change, or in other words, the exothermic parameter character of this interaction has not changed. We see that the entropy change, as well as the Gibbs free energy change, also remained relatively the same. And we see, most importantly, that the binding affinity of FUD for fibronectin did not change very much following PEGylation. We in fact see little change with the 10K PEG-FUD. With the 20K PEG-FUD, we see a rough doubling of the binding affinity, and then with the 40K PEG-FUD, we were able to extract a roughly 3 times larger binding affinity. But it's worthwhile to point out that this is still low nanomolar binding affinity. So these molecules should efficiently inhibit the fibronectin fibril assembly. So to explore that question, we used a matrix assembly in vitro assay. And in this type of an experiment, a confluent monolayer fibroblast is grown at the bottom of a well. These fibroblasts are then incubated with LXF488 labeled fibronectin. If there is no inhibition, then this fibronectin should be incorporated into the ECM of our cells, and then after a washing step, it should remain there and produce a positive fluorescence signal, or a larger fluorescence signal rather. However, in the case of total inhibition, after incubation of the drug with fibronectin, all drugs should be, and fibronectin should be removed following a washing step, producing a lower fluorescence intensity. And that is exactly what we were able to observe. First, I would like to zoom in on the 20K PEG-FUD control peptide that has no activity for fibronectin. You see that the fluorescence intensity observed with this peptide was concentration independent, as should be the case for a control peptide. However, the story was a little different with FUD and then the 10K PEG-FUD. We see a rapid reduction of fluorescence intensity with the concentration of the peptide. IC50 values were extracted, and we got a very similar IC50 for for both drugs, as well as that of the 40K PEG-FUD. So up to this point, we were thus able to accomplish the following. We were able to synthesize PEG-FUD. We're able to show that its binding affinity for fibronectin is fairly similar compared to, following PEGylation, and that the PEG-FUD pegylates, the PEG-FUD conjugates have an efficient fibronectin fibrinogenesis inhibition activity. The work up to here has been published in Pharmaceutical Research in 2018. So knowing this information, we then proceeded to evaluating PEG-FUD in a mirror model of renal fibrosis. The scheme for these experiments is summarized here. The specific model is the unilateral urethral model of renal fibrosis. This model involves constriction and then ligation of the ureter of one of the kidneys. This induces accumulation of urine in the kidney, and that induces very rapidly fibrosis in one of the kidneys of the animal. 3 days following induction of the model, the administration of the drug was started. For 6 days, a 12.5 milligram per kilogram single dose of drug was injected daily. Then, 24 hours following the last injection, the animals were sacrificed, and some endpoints listed here were explored. Those included fibronectin, collagen, content of the kidneys, CD45, CD45 density in the kidney, as well as general H&E staining. We had 3 control groups in these experiments. Those were saline, PEG, and then the 20K PEG-FUD control group. And 2 therapeutic compounds were also evaluated. Those were FUD and the 20K PEG-FUD. So let's go over some of the data now. The first thing that we're interested in is how much fibronectin was present in the fibrotic kidneys following administration of our drugs. The first panel shown here is that of the saline contra, which is the healthy kidney. Fibronectin is stained by this RAM-FN antibody that shows up as a brown signal. You see that there is little brown with the saline contra, but there is lots more fibronectin present in our 3 control groups, the saline PEG and PEG-FUD groups. With administration of PEG-FUD and FUD, we see a reduction of fibronectin present in this kidney tissue slices. The story was similar with collagen accumulation as well. Collagen was stained for using precursor as red. This stain allows for quantification of collagen content using the characteristic birefringence of that shows up under 24 hours light microscopy. With the saline contra, we see little collagen present in the kidney. In the 3 control groups, we see an increase of collagen present in the diseased kidney, and upon administration of PEG-FUD and FUD, we see a reduction of collagen. All these signals were quantified in MNJ, and we see that with the fibronectin data set, we see a rough doubling, or rather rough 2 times reduction of fibronectin present in the kidneys following administration of FUD. With PEG-FUD, this gain was doubled, and we see a 4 times reduction of fibronectin present in the kidneys. With collagen, the story is a little different. We see a 2 times reduction of collagen with both FUD and PEG-FUD groups, which is a good thing. This is what we want. We want a reduction of collagen present in the kidneys. But it's unclear why this superiority of fibronectin deposition reduction didn't translate into a superiority of collagen deposition reduction with PEG-FUD. And I would speculate that part of the reason why this could be the case is because collagen deposition is not exclusively driven by fibronectin. There are other factors involved. So we could approach a situation where we get diminished gains with fibronectin reduction. And this is a fundamental biological question that we would like to address in the future, and we certainly hope that it is. So on top of that, I would like to transition now to a slightly different aspect, and that is that of infiltrating cells. Here we see a general H&E staining of these kidney tissue slices, and we see that with the control groups there is an increased density of these purple bodies, which suggests that there is an increase of infiltrating cells in the diseased kidneys. And we see a reduction of this density with our therapeutics. This was corroborated by CD45 staining, which is an indicator of lymphocyte infiltration in the kidneys or in the tissue that you're analyzing. You see that with the staining contra, there is relatively little amount of CD45 staining showing up. When the disease model is induced, there's lots of CD45 signal. And upon treatment with PEG-FUD and FUD, this signal is reduced. We once again quantified this signal using image J, and we see a 2 times reduction of CD45 compared to the saline and the PEG-FUD control groups. Thus demonstrating another interesting feature of fibronectin inhibition therapy, meaning that it is able to attenuate or in other words, modulate the immune response at the disease organ. So that wraps up this data that I'd like to present for animal experiments. This work has been published in PLOS ONE in 2018. Knowing this, we moved on to exploring another interesting feature of PEGylation, and that is how will a larger PEGylated drug behave in an absorption context following administration? So an interesting thing is that PEGylation is known to, for example, reduce the probability of degradation of the drug. It also has been shown to reduce the renal clearance of the drug when the size of the PEG is big enough. Producing a sustained plasma concentration over time, and thus reducing the amount of required doses that you need to take. But what is surprising is that not as much work has been done to show how PEGylated therapeutics behave in a subcutaneous injection context. We hypothesized, and we have some previous evidence as well, that by increasing the molecular weight of FUD, we are able to slow down its absorption out of the subcutaneous site. So some of the evidence for that is that it's known well that molecular weight increase slows down the diffusion of a drug, reduces its tissue permeability. It also reduces the vascular permeability of the drug if the molecular weight is large enough. And it's in fact also known that when the molecular weight of a drug is less than 60,000 Dalton, it is able to enter general circulation through the capillaries. But when the size becomes greater than 16 Dalton, let's talk about 50, 100,000 Dalton, then an alternative pathway is taken by the drugs, a slower pathway, that of lymphatics. So we would like to see how all of this fits into our 3 different PEGylated FUDs. To test the absorption of the drug, of PEG-FUD out of the subcutaneous site, we used the in vitro imaging system as our instrument of choice, combined with a sulfosci-5 fluorophore. The reason why we chose sulfosci-5 is that because it has excellent photostability, and its spectral properties are such that it's close to near IR, thus reducing some of the issues that are associated with tissue permeability of the signal, etc. So to attach the sulfosci-5, we use NHS chemistry, in which the functional NHS group on the sci-5 is attacked by the primary amine on FUD to produce covalent linkage, or in other words, an added bond between the sulfosci-5 and the FUD peptide. At the end, this produces a brilliantly blue solution of our labeled drug. We ended up purifying the singly labeled drug using ion-exchange chromatography, as before. We verified the identity of the sci-5 labeled FUD with LCMS. we characterize the binding affinity of these labeled that they can bind fibronectin using fluorescence microscopy. So here are the ITC isothermal thermographs for the FUD, FUD Sci5, and the 20K PEG-FUD Sci5 experimental groups. Shown here are the binding parameters that we extracted from this interaction with fibronectin. And we see that the binding affinity of FUD Sci5 corresponded well with the previously that we have previously reported of FUD with fibronectin. Same thing was true also of the 20K PEG-FUD. So in other words, using isothermal titration calorimetry, we're able to show that the addition of Sci5 to both FUD and 20K PEG-FUD did not affect its binding affinity for fibronectin. So with that information in hand, we then use fluorescence microscopy as a technique to visualize the binding of these labeled Sci5 conjugates. These experiments involve growing a monolayer of fibroblasts at the bottom of the well, once again treating them with molecular-labeled fibronectin. Upon a washing step, this fibronectin was incorporated into the ECM of these cells, and these cells were then treated with the Sci5 labeled peptide to cover the surface of these peptides. And then upon washing, if there is significant binding between the drugs and fibronectin, then they should stay there, and we should be able to see them with fluorescence microscopy, which is exactly what we're able to show. So the three peptides that we experimented with were the 20K PEG-FUD, FUD itself, and then also the MFUD Sci5 that should have no binding activity for fibronectin. On the left, we see I'm showing just the Alexa 48 labeled fibronectin signals. In other words, we can see fibronectin fibrils in white. In red, we see the Sci5 signal. No fibronectin is shown, just the Sci5. And we see that there is this brilliantly red signal here, indicating that the labeled drug is bound to the surface of these fibroblasts. And then when you overlay the fibronectin and Sci5 signal, we see that these are shown exactly in the same place. So in other words, we see a co-localization of both signals. So using this experiment, we were able to show that the Sci5 labeled drug can bind to fibronectin. So that information in hand, we then moved on to finally evaluating the absorption of the drug out of the subcutaneous site. The rough schema of these experiments is shown here. They involve healthy, nude, athymic mice. A single dose of the drug was injected between the shoulder blades of these animals. They were placed underneath the detector on time points of 0, 30 minutes, and then 1, 3, 6, 12, 24, 6, and 48 hours. And they were imaged. The four drugs that we evaluated were just the FUD peptide, and then the three PEG-FUD. And what I like to stress is that not all of the drug was Sci5 labeled. We in fact spiked the drug solution with 1.5% content of the Sci5 labeled drug. So that's what we did. And we also repeated these experiments with the MFUD peptides, in other words, MFUD and then the three PEGylated. And that's a separate experiment I'll also show later. So let's now focus on the actual data. You see that before the drug dose was injected, there is no fluorescent signal. After the drug was injected, you see this hot spot between the shoulder blades of the animals. So you're looking at where the drug was injected right now, at time equals 0. And then after 30 minutes, you see a reduction of this fluorescence intensity over time until you can't detect the drug basically at the 24-hour mark. Now, here is an overlay of the PEGylated. We see that as we increase the molecular weight of the drug, the absorption is clearly slowed down because the fluorescence intensity is greater at longer time points. Also, anecdotally, you can look at the body of the animal, and you can see that the drug can still be detected in the body of the animal, even at 48 hours with the 40K PEG-FUD. But this tapers off around the 6 and 6 and 12 hour mark for the FUD peptide itself. All right? So the same thing was also true with the PEG peptide. Now the reason why you wanted to have this experiment is because PEG has no activity for fibronectin. So in other words, the binding of this drug to fibronectin is no longer an issue. So it allows us to answer the question of what will happen if you remove fibronectin binding out of the equation. And we see a similar behavior. We see that PEG absorbed the quickest, 40K PEG PEG absorbed the longest. When you look at the before injection panels, you see that there's this circle here. That's a region of interest that I drew around where the dose was injected. And then this region of interest was used to quantify the amount of fluorescence intensity present in each image. So the averages of each mouse were then quantified and plotted. And we see, and we can verify quantitatively what we saw visually, which is that the absorption is slowed down as the drug becomes larger. The half-lives of each absorption curve were calculated and then plotted versus molecular weight of each drug, and we see a linear relationship with an R-square correlation coefficient of 0.97 for the FUD peptide. A similar behavior was seen with the PEG peptide and its PEGylated. Once again, we're able to plot the half-lives of the subcutaneous absorption versus molecular weight, and we see a linear correlation with an R-square correlation coefficient of 0.99. So there was another interesting thing that we noticed as we were looking at these fluorescence images. If you recall, I mentioned earlier that glomerular filtration is proportional to the molecular weight of the drug. So the smallest drug should be eliminated by the kidney the quickest, and if the drug is in fact large enough, it should not enter the kidney at all. And it's a funny thing because with the peptide, we're literally able to resolve the kidneys in these images. So with the FUD, the biggest fluorescence intensity was detected at the 1 hour mark, and then it tapered off. With the 10K PEG-FUD, we saw smaller fluorescence intensity, but it was still there at a much later time point. With the 20K PEG-FUD, we saw a smaller fluorescence intensity at a 12 hour mark, and with the 40K PEG-FUD, you can't really see it at all, except maybe around the 36 hour mark. Now, the other interesting thing is that these time points also correlated for when you can detect the drug in the bladder of these animals, thus giving us basically 2 data points suggesting that the drug is renally cleared. Or specifically, FUD seems to be cleared by, or excreted by urine in the 30-minute to 6 hour mark. 10K PEG-FUD shifts a little bit. Now the interesting part is that you can still detect it in the bladder. You can still detect the 40K PEG-FUD in the bladder. I did not expect this, because I would have thought that it's large enough that it would not enter the kidneys at all. But it's also unclear if you're looking at the intact peptide, or its fragments, or just the dye itself. So I don't think we can exclusively say too much about that, but it's still an interesting thing. And it kind of verifies our expectation that as the drug becomes larger, the renal elimination of the drug is affected by that. Same thing was true of the PEG peptide. We see a large fluorescence intensity, and with the unconjugated or unpegylated drug around 1 hour, and we see less and less of the drug at a later time point with the increasing larger PEGylates. And the same thing was true of the abdominal views of the animal. So this concludes our presentation here today. In summary, in the first chapter, we were able to show that PEG-FUDs were successfully synthesized. We were able to verify their molecular weight. We were able to show that their binding affinity for fibronectin was not affected too much by PEGylation, and that our PEG-FUD conjugates retain their potent fibronectin fibrinogenesis inhibitory potency. In the second chapter, we were able to show that the 20K PEG-FUD has a superior fibronectin deposition reduction capability. And then lastly, in the third chapter, we're able to show that with increasingly larger PEG-FUD decreases, they're absorbed more slowly. This drug has many potential applications, and it's actually quite unfortunate that I'm not able to pursue most of them because there are so many things we could do with it. But I think one of the most important things that is still yet to be done is to do a full study that gives us a plasma concentration profile of the differently sized PEGylate, so that we can know, so we can pick the exact PEG-FUD that we think is most effective. Now, another thing that I think is a super high impact area is the combination of PEG-FUD with rapamycin for treatment of fibrosis. Rapamycin has some literature that in fact has been shown in the UO model to have an anti-fibrosis effect, and I think that in combination these drugs can be even more effective, synergistic together. And then also PEG-FUD there's literature basis to suggest that PEG-FUD can have an anti-cancer application. So I would strongly suggest evaluating in that context in the future. So that brings us to conclusion. I'd like to thank everybody here. I'd like to thank, of course, the big man, Dr. Kwan himself, also the current Kwan Lab members, as well as those in the past. I think I have, yeah. I also like to thank my thesis committee. Thank you for your valuable input and constructive criticism throughout the years. I'd like to thank my collaborators. I'd like to thank Dr. Bianca Tomasini Johansson for you have been quite the mentor to me, and I appreciate and thank you everything that you've taught me, and also your friendship along the lines as well. So thank you. I'd like to thank the UW Madison School of Pharmacy and the NIH for supporting our lab throughout the years. And I guess the last thing to say is that the last 5 years have been full of ups and downs. I had some challenges along the way. One of them was medical, and I just like to thank everybody. One of the lessons that I have learned here is that equipment, funds, and resources matter, but ultimately it's the people that make the difference. And in my opinion, it is the people of this School of Pharmacy that make this the best university in the Midwest. And I'd just like to thank all of you for this opportunity. Thank you. I'd like to welcome your questions.
Students, don't be shy. This is your last time to give Pawel a hard time. Yeah, Joe.
So I'm really interested in, right, so you're not only seeing that your fibronectin is decreasing, but also that your collagen is sort of increasing, right, in your chapter 2.
Yep.
Do you have an idea of what mechanism is that? Is that the fact that fibronectin is basically not having the accumulation of those collagens so then they can be cleaved, or how do you, what makes you think that the collagen can also decrease with the?
Yeah, so the deposition of collagen is controlled by many factors. And really the information that we have is what is the end point, what's the end of the story. But for example, fibronectin is involved in collagen deposition in at least 2 ways. One of them is by directly forming a scaffold onto which collagen fibers can build. And there are some theories for how that works. One of the theories, for example, states that, that it's possible that fibronectin deposition allows recruitment of integrants that then can act to facilitate the deposition of collagen. That's something that can happen. Other factors are involved as well. For example, fibronectin facilitates attachment of inflammatory lymphocytes. Those can have pro-collagen deposition effects. But lastly, I guess I should have said this in the middle, not at the end. The lysyl oxidase is a huge factor. Lysyl oxidase facilitates the cross-linking of collagen fibers and then their maturation. And fibronectin is known to promote LOX activity. So that could be another contributing factor. Sorry?
Yeah, I might have missed that in the beginning, but you mentioned that FUD directly has a 3x reduction in fibronectin, I believe, right, the way beginning of your slide.
That was a liver fibrosis model.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So then, yeah, my question was then, why is 3x not enough? I mean, like, how much would PEG affect this, I guess?
Yeah. Well, that's a difficult question to answer. I suppose I could speculate. And, right. So to develop an effective anti-fibrosis therapy, you have to pick the right model that is clinically relevant, right? So one of the important, interesting questions that I think should be asked is, in a human being that has liver fibrosis, how do you find that fibrotic event? Is it in the beginning? So is someone having, liver cirrhosis, they're drinking over the course of 20 years and they're taking PEG-FUD along the way? That's not what's happening. What's happening is that you're finding a mature fibrotic organ, right? And then you're treating that. So for example, if you may have noticed that our EO model involves co-administration of FUD or PEG-FUD rather, as you induce the disease model. Well, you find a mature fibrotic condition in a clinical event. So it's very important to pick the right model and then explore it that way, which is, yeah. Hope that answered your question.
Right, just a quick follow-up on that. So when you say with fibrosis, then I would expect, and this is intuitive, I don't know if this has any basis, but you would expect the penetration of the PEG and the FUD by itself to decrease, or is that wrong?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
So you said you would find in the wild, you would find these things where the disease state has matured, like it's not a mom, it's like the thing is about to die.
Right.
And so you need to, when you administer your drug, is it going to penetrate through with that much fibrosis already present?
Well, so this is, I guess what I was trying to present that didn't really come out very well. It's that if you have an already established mature network of, for example, collagen, smooth muscle actin, alpha smooth muscle actin, all those other ECM proteins, reducing the fibronectin deposition might not necessarily affect those things, right? So that's an important thing, which is not, but on the other hand, ECM is dynamic, there's constant turnover. And the liver is also a very special organ that has has proliferative abilities, so perhaps that's why they're able to see an improvement in liver function. Now, whether or not this will be the case for every case of fibrosis, that remains to be seen. Yeah.
So I want to say this is a great presentation. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot too. When it comes to, I guess, delivering peptides, one thing I've always seen is, immune recognition of peptides, right? Peptides invoking an immune response. And I'm wondering, I don't really know much about FUD, but does FUD provoke an immune response, and can PEGylated FUD help, hinder that immune response?
In my literature search, I have found references to PEGylation being able to assist with that. So in other words, there being a very large PEG on your therapeutic could sterically inhibit, first of all, interaction of proteases with the drug, but then also some immune components were also inhibited that way. We have not personally explored that in the context of FUD. That is an interesting question to ask. There are more things to say about that, but you make a good point that perhaps that could be a third, or a fourth benefit of PEGylating this drug. But as an aside, I could also see it going the other way, so some experiments would have to be made to be sure.
Just so in that regard, people have tried to make antibodies to this part of the collagens protein. This is very difficult. So PEGylation, I think, should help in people with these giving it more type of reaction, but the peptide binds or that portion of the F1 protein to that, it's actually enters the nectar.
The epitope's the same, I guess.
Yeah. So, but I think regulation, it was that was part of the reason for it.
Yeah. And it's probably worthwhile to point out also that FUD is an inherently mobile, flexible molecule, so designing an antibody for something like that can be quite challenging. Scotty?
Yes, in your searching the literature for this, what made you decide to use this particular mouse model? Do you have any knowledge of how well that would translate ultimately into humans? Or are there any deficiencies that you can see in doing this in mice?
That is a question that Dr. Bianco, who best suited to answer.
So it has fairly good translation. I mean, not this, I think it just happens to be a fairly good model to get results from. Unfortunately, you can't measure renal function, so that was a caveat. Because the other kidney is always active, so that would, if you knock one and I cannot pull out, you still have renal function. But so we were aiming towards like ischemic reperfusion model where you could have measured renal function. But that was a more complicated model for our abilities, and it took longer to run it. And we were restricted in time and amount of material. It takes a lot of work to create this, to generate the amount of FUD and PEG-FUD. So Pawel worked really hard to get all this for us to, yeah. So those really were the reasons.
Sure.
Okay.
We're also collaborating with Dr. Sample here in the lung fibrosis model. We have good results there too. It's becoming a more popular peptide in the literature for sure.
So one thing that you didn't mention about the PEG-FUDs, maybe I'll ask it as a question. Can you talk about maybe targeting to organs?
Targeting the organs.
So you talked about sort of its retention
Mm-hmm.
in the body, in the circulation and its renal excretion.
Right. So now, naturally, just PEG itself, by the nature of what it is, I don't think you can use that itself as a, like for example, you can target a kidney by conjugating lysozyme onto a drug because that will selectively eliminate the kidney. What you can do though is exploit the fact that in a fibrosis event, there is an aberration in vasculature present in the organ. So this is a very analogous thing to the EPR effect, the enhanced permeability and retention effect, where if you have more leaky vasculature, then if you have a much larger drug, it will want to stay in the vasculature, but it will permeate the organ that, for example, has fibrosis. So in such a way, there is some precedent for how this PEGylated FUD therapy could lead to organ targeting.
I think he's asking relative to the effect on remember when you were doing the optical imaging, you actually picked up on some.
Oh, I see. Oh, well, of course. Yeah. Well, when you have a fibrotic organ, you have lots of fibronectin being expressed there. So if you have some kind of a fluorophore labeled or radio labeled drug, then the drug will bind to that fibronectin and thus perhaps be used as an imaging agent in that particular context. Yeah.
Did you bring the image of the mouse room?
Oh, I didn't.
Anyway, I thought that's an interesting story.
Well, it is an interesting story because as I was doing these ISIS experiments, there's an ear tag, right? Like you tag it with an ear tag, so in other words, you wound the animal at the ear. And I've noticed that after a couple of days, the ear would start showing up on my fluorescence images of these mice. And in fact, what I think must be happening is that the drug must be making its way into the actual scab So in other words, where there's fibronectin, you can now see the drug there. And that's an interesting thing because, I mean, imagine that there's an internal trauma and there's some kind of a wound inside. You can't see it because it's inside. Then using a fibronectin binder that has some kind of an imaging agent attached to it, you can actually not visually, but spectroscopically visualize the wound inside and perhaps use PEG-FUD as a diagnostic tool, or if you're aiming to also treat the animal, then a diagnostic tool, and have 2 in 1.
The other thing, I just make one comment about pulmonary fibrosis. So fibronectin is routinely identified as one of the most, both with genomics and proteomics, is one of the most highly upregulated proteins in the fibrotic human and animal model. So it's a very abundant mark, potentially a good marker for the activity of fibrosis. So again, adding to what you just
And I'll add on to you now, because now that I think about it, it's also upregulated in cancer in lots of ways. So in addition to wounds, you could also use PEG-FUD as an imaging agent for example, looking at metastasis, looking at developed mature tumor stroma, things along that line. So there definitely is lots of potential for this drug.
So while you were away, we tested its anti-tumor activity. It appears to be just as equal effective as paclitaxel, which is crazy. So, yeah, hopefully we're on to something. Okay, any other questions? Okay, Paul's parents bought a lot of food, so it looks delicious. So, just want you to grab some. Thank you for coming, and we'll go into closed session.